Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your most pressing, frustrating, and sometimes, provocative questions, filter them through the lens of rigorous academic sources, and give you that intellectual shortcut you need to be truly well-informed. Our source material today is pretty broad. We're touching on everything from sociolinguistics and neuroscience to cognitive science, sociology, the works, and it all centers on a query that is maybe one of the oldest, most frustrating in human communication. Why is it so hard to understand women? Now, if you shared this question with us, you are definitely wrestling with a very real experience, that friction, that genuine repeated communication breakdown where, you feel like you're speaking entirely different languages. Intentions might be good, but the outcome, just frustration. That experience is valid. We get it. And we are absolutely going to treat that systemic friction with the seriousness it deserves.
And that's exactly where we have to start, right? We validate the experience of friction, absolutely. But we also have to challenge the premise of the question itself. We need to look at the historical context first, because the sources point out something really critical about the history of psychology as a field.
Okay.
For a long time, for much of its life, it was effectively womanless and raceless, frankly. It operated under this kind of unspoken assumption that the male experience, often the white male experience, was just the default, the norm.
Okay. So by setting up this narrow default, anything that falls outside of that, any difference in how people communicate or express emotion or what they prioritize in relationships, it gets flagged immediately.
Exactly. It's instantly put into a box labeled atypical or deficient, or the word that's central to our deep dive today, difficult. This historical bias, it's sort of baked right into how we even observe and label human behavior. And that filters down, into our everyday assumptions about relationships.
The sources make a really pivotal reframe here, one we just have to grab onto from the start. The query itself takes a problem that's fundamentally relational. It's a system failure, right? A breakdown in a two-way street.
Yeah.
And it frames it as a dispositional problem, like it's about the person being observed.
Correct. So instead of asking the productive question, the one that might actually lead somewhere, like, what systemic factors caused us to fail to communicate here? The observer, maybe unconsciously, defaults to that dispositional error. What's wrong with that person that makes them inherently difficult?
Right. Okay. So our mission today, then, is to pivot. We're moving away from that flawed question, why is it so hard to understand women? And we're moving towards the truly insightful one. What systemic, social, and cognitive factors are actually producing the friction that we mistakenly label as difficulty? And maybe more importantly, what actionable steps can we take to actually mitigate those factors?
Yeah, exactly. Because our sources argue pretty strongly that this difficulty isn't inherent. It's more like a cognitive illusion, a systematic misinterpretation that gets manufactured by four deeply interacting pressures.
Okay, 4 pressures. Let's map them out. We're going to cover all 4. First up, mismatched communication goals.
Yeah.
That's rooted in sociolinguistics.
Right.
Second, divergent socialized scripts for how we express emotion.
Yep. Developmental psychology comes in there.
Third, the sociological reality of invisible labor, burnout, and how that gets misattributed. That sounds huge.
It's the big one. Crucial.
And finally, number 4, cultural priming, how media and cognitive biases basically set up the observer's own mind to expect difficulty.
Exactly. And that last point is really where it all culminates. Ultimately, we're going to shift the focus almost entirely from the person being observed to the mind of the observer.
Okay, this sounds like quite a cascade. Let's unpack it, starting with that classic academic framework. The one that first really gave us a language for why communication breaks down so often. Okay, so when people try to explain these communication breakdowns, between men and women, they often land on this idea like they belong to completely different cultures or have fundamentally different psychologies. And the academic foundation for why that feeling is so strong, why it feels so real, often traces back to the really influential work of sociolinguist Dr. Deborah Tannen.
Yeah, Tannen's framework, it's indispensable,
Right.
really, because it does such a good job of diagnosing the moment of friction, where things go wrong. She argues the differences aren't fundamentally biological, they're sociolinguistic. It's about how we learn to use language.
Okay.
So her idea is that boys and girls, they tend to grow up being socialized in different kinds of play groups. They learn different rules for talking. And this effectively creates 2 distinct social cultures, which then lead to 2 different primary styles of communication in adulthood. She called them genderlex.
Genderlex.
So when these 2 styles meet, say, in a relationship or at work, it's almost like a form of cross-cultural communication. And like any cross-cultural interaction, it's prone to misunderstanding.
Let's define those 2 core styles then, as the sources lay them out. The first one is rapport talk. Cannon identified this as the prototypical female style.
Right. Rapport talk, it's all about connection. That's the primary goal. Building and maintaining relationships, expressing intimacy, trying to establish social harmony. And that's what you see certain communication behaviors linked to it. Things like really active listening, using conversational overlap, not to interrupt, but to show support, like, oh, me too.
Like chiming in.
Exactly. Constant verbal affirmations, right, exactly. And sharing private thoughts or details to build that closeness, that intimacy. It's communication focused on the relationship itself.
Okay, relationship-centric.
Yeah.
The counterpoint to that is report talk, which is pegged as the prototypical male style.
Yes. Report talk. Here, the primary goal kind of shifts. It moves away from connection and more towards status and information exchange.
Status.
Yeah. Report talk tends to focus on preserving independence, conveying quantifiable information, facts, data, and maintaining one's position in what's often perceived as a social hierarchy.
And how does that play out? What are the behaviors?
Well, you might see things like telling stories or jokes where the teller comes out looking good, sort of showing off capacities, maybe dominating conversational turns, holding the floor longer. And critically, a big one is immediately offering solutions to problems. Because offering a solution demonstrates capacity, expertise, status. The communication becomes more task-centric or status-centric.
Okay, rapport versus report. Connection versus status.
Yeah.
And this leads us right into that classic failure scenario, the sources detail. The one that really illustrates why the misunderstanding can feel so total, so frustrating. It's the interaction between Abby, the analyst, and Daniel, her supervisor. Abby goes to Daniel,
Right.
and she says something like, "The guys in finance keep changing their numbers on me, and honestly, I'm just incredibly frustrated and stressed out by this constant moving target."
Okay, so Abby here is using rapport talk pretty clearly. She's not actually asking for a solution, not yet anyway.
Right. What's her goal?
Her goal is validation, connection. She wants Daniel to acknowledge how frustrating her situation is, to provide some relational support. She's hoping to hear something like, wow, that sounds absolutely exhausting. I'm really sorry they're making your job so much harder. Empathy.
But Daniel, who's maybe operating more from a report talk script, hears something different. He hears a problem that needs fixing.
Exactly. He hears a problem, and his role as supervisor, perhaps combined with his socialization, primes him to assert his status by being a capable problem solver.
So he jumps straight to solutions.
Right. He defaults to offering concrete fixes. Well, maybe you should stop relying on their data altogether and just run the analysis for all the projections yourself. Or why don't you go back and talk to them and just demand they give you the final numbers?
And Abby pushes back, right? She says maybe she's already tried those or they won't work. And the conversation just stalls, grinds to a halt.
And they both walk away feeling frustrated and perceiving the other person as difficult.
Why? Let's break that down.
Abby feels deeply misunderstood because her primary goal, validation, connection, was completely missed. Plus, she might feel like Daniel minimized her problem by just jumping to simplistic solutions.
Okay. And Daniel?
Daniel feels rejected and frustrated. His status-affirming solutions, his attempt to help in the way he knows best, were shot down. So he might perceive Abby as being resistant to logic or maybe just complaining without wanting help. Difficult.
Wow. Okay, that qualitative framework, Tannen's rapport versus report, it perfectly explains the feeling of friction.
Yeah.
Why it feels like a 100% breakdown. But as you mentioned earlier, we run the risk of falling straight into that men are from Mars, women are from Venus trap if we stop there. We have to immediately contrast that feeling, that qualitative experience, with the hard statistical reality. If the difference feels total, what does the actual data say about how different men and women are psychologically?
Right. This is where the quantitative side comes in, and it's crucial. Specifically, the work around the gender similarities hypothesis, most famously championed by Dr. Janet Shibley-Hyde. Tannen gives us the vocabulary for the conflict, you could say. Hyde corrects our sense of the scale of the underlying difference.
And Hyde's work is just staggering in scope, isn't it? She did what's called a meta-analysis.
Yeah, it's incredible. She reviewed 46 previous meta-analyses, so studies that had already aggregated hundreds, sometimes thousands of individual studies.
Yeah.
Meaning she was effectively looking at data from over 12 million people to assess the size of psychological differences between genders.
Okay, so what did this massive analysis of 12 million people find?
Well, the conclusion is pretty shocking, especially for people who've grown up steeped in pop psychology ideas about vast differences. The headline finding is this. Of the 124 psychological gender differences they could reliably document across all these studies, a massive 78% of them were in the small or close to zero range.
Okay, wait. We need to pause right there and unpack what small or close to zero actually means statistically, because
Yeah.
that number, 78%, sounds huge, but the size of the difference is key. You mentioned the D score.
Absolutely critical. The B score, or Cohen's d, is a standard way to measure effect size. Basically, it tells you how much overlap there is between two groups. It measures how far apart the average score of one group is from the average score of the other group, using standard deviations as the ruler.
Right, so a big D score means the groups are really far apart, not much overlap. A small D score means
They're very close together. The overlap is massive. Conventionally, a D of zero point 0.2 is considered small, zero point 0.5 is medium, and zero point 0.8 is large.
So when Hyde says 78% of the documented differences have effect sizes that are small, like D between 0.11 and 0.35, or even close to 0D, less than or equal to 0.10.
She's quantifying just how similar men and women are, psychologically speaking, overwhelmingly similar. That massive overlap means that for over 3/4 of the characteristics studied, things like personality traits, cognitive abilities, communication behaviors, the distribution curves for men and women look almost identical. They share something like 80% of their area.
So knowing someone's gender tells you almost nothing about their individual psychology on most measures.
Pretty much. To put it bluntly, the variation within a single gender, the differences between individual men or between individual women, is far, far greater than the average difference between the genders. Your personality, your age, the specific context you're in, those are vastly more reliable predictors of how you'll communicate or behave than just knowing if you're male or female.
Okay, that's the academic reality. Near similarity, huge overlap.
Ha!
So here's the million-dollar question then. If the statistical reality is so close to similarity, why is the perception of this vast planet-sized divide so incredibly pervasive? Where does that come from? Does tannins work, maybe by giving us language to describe the difference, inadvertently help essentialize it, make it seem bigger than it is?
That's precisely the heart of the academic debate around Tannen's work. Her framework is invaluable for showing where the friction happens, right? The mechanism of misunderstanding. But almost immediately, it got kind of weaponized by pop psychology because it offered a simple, seemingly non-judgmental explanation for conflict. It felt intuitive.
And it provided the perfect intellectual-sounding fuel
For the John Gray phenomenon, exactly.
Yeah, we have to talk about Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, that 1992 bestseller. Our sources are pretty much unanimous on this one, aren't they?
Yeah.
Scientifically problematic.
Oh, absolutely. The academic community, particularly those who actually study relationships and communication scientifically, generally views Gray's work as, well, let's just say, not helpful. Detrimental, even.
Why? What's the core problem?
It completely lacks any rigorous scientific basis. Gray himself basically said he built his thesis on what I have observed and anecdotes, that's just classic confirmation bias, seeing what you expect to see, confirming stereotypes, not challenging them with actual data. And the core harm it does is that it essentializes gender. It claims these communication styles, these ways of being, are innate, fixed, unchangeable parts of being male or female, like we're different species.
Right, and if you essentialize it, if you say it's innate and unchangeable,
Then there's no room for individuality, no room for context, no room for change or growth. It basically teaches people that conflict is unavoidable because the two sides are just fundamentally biologically different. That's just how men and women are.
and that whole essentialist argument just completely falls apart when you look at the actual data points, right? The ones that shatter those popular stereotypes.
Falls apart immediately. Let's look at that table our sources provided. It's really eye-opening.
Okay, first one, talkativeness. The popular belief, the stereotype, is that women talk vastly more than men. Chatterboxes, right?
Right. The data on actual talkativeness, the effect size, Cohen's d, is 0.07.
0.07.
That's firmly in the close to zero difference category. Statistically, men and women are virtually identical in how much they speak.
Wow, okay. Next stereotype. Women are emotional experts. They're naturally better at reading emotions, maybe even mind reading.
The data shows a small, consistent advantage for women in accurately recognizing and decoding nonverbal emotional cues. The effect size is D 0.24.
Okay, 0.24. That's officially in the small range. So
Yeah.
there's a measurable difference in advantage, but it's small.
Yep.
It's definitely not some kind of superpower that supports the cultural narrative of women being mystical emotion whisperers.
Not at all. And now contrast those tiny numbers, 0.07 and 0.24, with a genuine, undeniable, biologically based difference. Something like throwing velocity.
Okay, how fast people can throw a ball.
The effect size there is D2.18.
2.18, that's enormous.
That's a very large difference. The overlap between men and women on throwing velocity is minimal.
So that comparison is really powerful. When people believe there's a profound difference in communication styles, they're often acting as if a D 0.07 difference, talkativeness, or a D 0.24 difference, emotion recognition, is somehow equivalent to a D 2.18 difference, throwing velocity.
Exactly. The perception is completely divorced from the statistical reality.
So let's try to synthesize this first section. What's the takeaway?
The synthesis is this. A relatively small divergence in communication goals, rapport versus report happening in a specific, maybe high-stakes moment, can absolutely create a feeling of 100% communication failure. Total breakdown.
That feeling is real.
That feeling is real. But then pop culture, fueled by things like Mars versus Venus, takes that momentary failure, ignores all the times communication works fine, and magnifies it into this fictional planet-level divide. And that fictional divide then justifies the belief that the other person is inherently difficult or unknowable.
So the perceived difficulty is really the gap. It's the gap between a momentary, understandable relational conflict based on slightly different goals.
And the statistically false, culturally reinforced narrative that turns that moment into proof of fundamental, unbridgeable difference.
Okay, so if these differences aren't innate, if they're not biological destiny, how do they get built? How do these small statistical differences sometimes manifest as consistent clashing styles?
That brings us squarely into the realm of socialization, how society shapes us from a very young age and essentially trains us into incompatible emotional scripts. Right, so if we accept Hyde's big conclusion that innate psychological differences are mostly small or non-existent, then the logical next question is, how do these small seeds of difference, or maybe even just societal expectations, get built up into these consistent, often clashing communication styles we see?
Yeah, where does the pattern come from?
This is where the biopsychosocial model really comes into play. The idea is that society acts as this massive shaping force. You have parents, peers, schools, media, all these socializing agents that channel even tiny potential biological differences in things like temperament. And they magnify them, they shape them, they reward gender-conforming behavior, they discourage behavior that doesn't fit the mold. And over time, this creates distinct gendered scripts.
And these scripts, they don't just dictate like what toys we play with.
Yeah.
They dictate how we're supposed to handle emotions, right? How we process them, how we express them.
Exactly. They're emotional toolkits, in a way. Let's look at the typical script often encouraged for girls, according to the sources. Socialization for girls is heavily weighted towards achieving relational harmony, cooperation, open expression of feelings, especially vulnerable ones. Girls are often trained, explicitly or implicitly, to be the keepers of the emotional sphere in relationships. They're encouraged to talk about feelings, to process things verbally, and often to take on the role of the emotional caretaker for others. This tends to channel their emotional expression towards what psychologists call internalizing emotions, things like sadness, fear, anxiety, maybe even self-blame.
Okay, so focus on relationships, harmony, talking things through, internalizing. What about the script typically pushed on boys?
It's often almost the mirror opposite. The traditional script for boys emphasizes logic, task completion, independence, and crucially, emotional control.
Control.
Yeah. Boys are frequently socialized, especially by other boys, to avoid showing vulnerability at all costs. It's seen as weakness, a loss of status, so their emotional expression gets channeled towards externalizing emotions, primarily anger, aggression, maybe competitive joking, or stoicism. They're taught that showing the messy process of emotion is not okay.
So when Abby and Daniel from an earlier example collide in the workplace,
We're not necessarily seeing a fundamental difference in their character or their internal feelings. We're seeing a clash between two different socially constructed emotional toolkits.
built under pressure.
Built under pressure, exactly. And they're trying to execute two different goals, connection versus status, using these very different, often incompatible, learned strategies.
And this leads us to what you called maybe the most crucial psychological distinction in this whole discussion.
Yes. We absolutely have to distinguish between emotional expression, what we show on the outside, and emotional internal experience, what's actually happening inside.
Because the stereotype.
We can't see inside their head, but we can measure their physiology. And this is where it gets really interesting. Studies that track physiological arousal, things like blood pressure, heart rate, the release of stress hormones like cortisol when men and women are exposed to the same highly stressful or emotional stimuli,
Yeah.
they often show that men experience equal or sometimes even greater levels of internal physiological arousal than women do. Their bodies are reacting just as strongly, sometimes more strongly, on the inside.
Oh, okay. Let me make sure I'm getting the implication there. If the internal involuntary physical response to stress, the racing heart, the cortisol spike is the same, or even higher in men,
Uh-huh.
but their outward expression is much more muted, more controlled. That means they're successfully suppressing the outward manifestation of that internal arousal.
Mm-hmm.
They're feeling it physiologically, but they're succeeding at keeping it hidden, just like their social script taught them to do.
That's the interpretation, and it's profound. We're likely witnessing a difference in regulation strategy, learned through socialization, not necessarily a difference in the fundamental feeling itself.
One group is highly trained in suppression. The other is highly trained in expression and relational processing.
Exactly.
And this difference in how emotion is processed, how it's regulated, it's actually confirmed beautifully at a neurological level too, right? There was that really striking fMRI study from 2018.
Yes, that study is fascinating. It looks specifically at something called cognitive reappraisal. That's basically our ability to actively regulate and reduce negative feelings by thinking about the situation differently.
Okay, so managing your own emotions. How did men and women compare?
Well, behaviorally, they were the same. When researchers asked them to look at negative images and actively try to decrease their negative feelings, both men and women were equally successful at calming themselves down. They achieved the same outcome.
Okay, same result. But the brain scans showed.
The brain scans showed they were using different neural pathways to get to that same calm state. That's the key insight.
How so?
Men, on average, showed less activation in the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain associated with effortful, conscious, cognitive work, like thinking through a problem logically or talking it out.
Okay, less prefrontal activity.
They showed greater decreases in activity in the amygdala, which is like the brain's emotional threat detection center.
So if we connect that back to the socialization scripts,
Yeah.
what could that mean?
Well, one interpretation is that the men might be defaulting to a faster, more automatic suppression strategy, shoving the emotion down quickly. This requires less active, conscious work in the prefrontal cortex, but effectively dampens the amygdala's alarm signal.
Okay, automatic suppression.
And women. Women, in contrast, tended to show more activation in those prefrontal regions. The researchers suggested this aligns with a more cognitively active process of reappraisal. This involves more effortful work, maybe actively reframing the situation, thinking it through, perhaps needing to verbalize it or process it relationally to make sense of it, which sounds a lot like
rapport talk in action, processing the feeling to manage it.
Exactly. So you can see how this difference in process leads directly to misunderstanding and the perception of difficulty.
Yeah, explain that connection.
Okay, picture a couple having a disagreement. He might be using that fast automatic suppression strategy. Internally, he might be just as upset, but outwardly she seems calm, maybe even shut down.
Right.
She might be using the more active cognitive reappraisal strategy, which involves talking, processing, maybe getting upset while she works through it.
So he perceives her active talking it out process as dwelling on it, overthinking, being too emotional, because his brain is using a different, less outwardly effortful strategy.
Precisely. And she perceives his automatic suppression, his outward calm, as stonewalling, being cold, not caring, because she's looking for the signs of active processing that her brain uses, and she's not seeing them.
Wow. So they both successfully regulated their emotion eventually, maybe, but they completely misinterpret the other person's regulation strategy as a stable, negative character flaw.
That's the tragic misinterpretation. The perceived difficulty is just a fundamental misunderstanding of the neurosocial route they each take to get to the same emotional destination, feeling better.
This brings us back to that small statistical difference we mentioned earlier from Hyde's work. The 0.24 advantage women tend to have in decoding affect cues, reading emotions non-verbally.
Yes. And it's crucial to understand why that small advantage likely exists. It's probably not some innate magical gift.
It's trained.
It's very likely a skill trained through that intense relational socialization we talked about. Girls are often encouraged, even required, to pay close attention to the emotional states of others to maintain harmony. It requires motivation and constant attention.
So that small, trained advantage in reading others.
It's the prerequisite. It's the baseline skill required for the unpaid, often unacknowledged job of being the emotional caretaker.
And because society often implicitly assigns women that role.
They become obligated to take on this constant burden of relational and emotional management, which is what our sources identify as the third major factor manufacturing the perception of difficulty.
The invisible labor. And this is where the system really starts to break down, isn't it? Turning these trained relational managers into people perceived as difficult or irrational. Okay, so let's recap. If the big statistical differences aren't really there, and the internal emotional experience is probably more similar than we think, then the profound frustration and perceived difficulty that people experience must be coming from somewhere else. Not innate biology, not fundamental psychology, but maybe a theology. Unequal systems.
Exactly. This is where the sources really shift focus to the sociological reality. They argue that a huge, often hidden driver of perceived difficulty is the invisible workload of what's often called emotional labor, or the mental load. And the difficulty observed is frequently just a symptom of chronic exhaustion and burnout from carrying that unequal load.
We should probably clarify the terminology here because emotional labor gets used in a few ways.
Good point. We need to start with the original definition from sociologist Arlie Hochschild back in 1983. For Hochschild, emotional labor specifically meant managing your own feelings as a required part of your paid job, usually to influence the feelings or experience of a customer.
Like the classic example of the flight attendant who has to smile and be pleasant even when dealing with a rude passenger or feeling stressed herself.
Precisely. Managing her own emotions for the company's benefit. But since then, as you said, there's been concept creep.
Right. The term is expanded.
It's expanded to include what some now call emotion work, similar tasks, but happening in the private, unpaid sphere of home and relationships. And this often gets bundled under the umbrella term, the mental load.
The mental load. Let's define that. What does it actually entail?
The mental load isn't just doing chores, it's the cognitive labor behind the chores. It's the planning, the organizing, the anticipating, the decision-making required to keep a household, a relationship, a family running smoothly.
So it's not just doing the laundry. It's noticing the basket is full, remembering to buy detergent, knowing how to sort it, scheduling time to do it.
Exactly. It's the labor of noticing what needs to be done. It's anticipating the emotional needs of others, remembering birthdays, planning gifts, checking in on relatives. It's coordinating logistics, school forms, doctor's appointments, car maintenance, managing social calendars. And crucially, it's the constant, often 24/7 background hum of maintaining relational harmony. Smoothing over conflicts, managing moods, making sure everyone feels okay. It's essentially being the unpaid project manager and HR department for the relationship or family.
And the sources are clear, echoing decades of social science research. This invisible, unpaid, relentless second shift. It falls disproportionately on women, especially in heterosexual partnerships.
Yes, and it falls on them largely because it's seen as a direct continuation of that emotional caretaker script they were socialized into back in Section 2. Society expects it.
Okay, now here comes what the sources identify as the pivotal insight of this section, the connection to difficulty.
Right. The observer, maybe the partner, maybe someone else experiences the woman's resulting behavior.
Which might be.
Frustration, exhaustion, resentment maybe, impatience, a shorter fuse, maybe she seems less engaged or complains more. These are all understandable symptoms of chronic burnout from carrying an unequal, invisible workload.
Okay, so those are the symptoms. But the observer.
The observer often unconsciously commits a massive attribution error. Instead of correctly attributing her behavior to the situational cause, the crushing weight of the unequal, invisible workload.
They attribute it to her dispositional character.
Bingo. She's just irrational. She's always complaining about something. She's so hard to understand lately. Why is she so emotional all the time?
The problem is profound misattribution. The perceived difficulty isn't an innate trait. It's a symptom of systemic exhaustion that the observer isn't seeing or acknowledging.
Absolutely. And the sources use that classic milk example to show how this plays out in a small, everyday interaction. It's a perfect micro-collision of rapport talk, report talk, and invisible labor.
Okay, lay out the milk example.
So, the woman might express frustration because the household is out of milk, or maybe the dog is overdue for a vet appointment, or a permission slip wasn't signed.
Right, something practical.
But her frustration deep down usually isn't really about the milk itself or even the specific task. It's about the labor of noticing that the milk was running low in the first place. It's about the labor of remembering the vet appointment needed scheduling. She's upset about the underlying system, the fact that she's the default manager responsible for tracking all these things.
Okay, so she uses rapport talk, maybe venting her frustration about the systemic inequity.
I feel like I have to keep track of everything around here.
Yes. But her partner, perhaps operating from a report talk perspective, here's a specific complaint about a specific task, milk, vet slip. And what does report talk do?
Offers a solution. Fix the immediate problem.
Right, so the partner says something like, oh, sorry, well, why didn't you just ask me to get milk? Just put it on the list next time. Or, okay, I'll call the vet tomorrow.
And that response, which seems helpful from a report talk view,
Can be psychologically infuriating to the person carrying the mental load. Why?
yeah,
Because it completely confirms her fear. He doesn't see the management job. He sees himself as the hourly laborer who just needs to be assigned tasks from her, the unpaid permanent manager.
he fails to grasp that the real work, the cognitive labor, the part causing the burnout, is having to constantly scan the environment, anticipate needs, make the list, and then manage him to do the things on the list. Exactly. So her entirely logical, predictable increase in frustration after his solution, because he just demonstrated he doesn't get the real problem, is then often labeled by him as further proof that she's irrational or difficult or making a big deal out of nothing.
Wow. She's not difficult to understand at all in that moment. She's a burned out, unpaid manager whose coworker essentially just refused to even acknowledge that the management job exists, let alone offer to share the actual noticing and planning duties.
Precisely. And this mental load, this invisible labor, it goes way beyond just milk and permission slips, right? Think about bigger things, the huge sociological weight of planning labor.
Yeah, give us another example.
Okay, planning a family vacation
Yes.
or coordinating all the logistics for a major holiday gathering.
Oh, yeah. Huge projects.
Huge, mostly invisible projects. Planning a vacation isn't one task, it's like 100 interdependent tasks. It involves researching destinations within a budget, finding accommodation that suits everyone, booking travel, coordinating time off work, planning activities that cater to different ages and interests, maybe reading hundreds of reviews, creating packing lists, anticipating potential problems, managing everyone's expectations and anxieties.
Okay, yeah, that's a massive cognitive load.
Massive. Now, if one partner does all that planning, all that cognitive and emotional labor, and the other partner only handles the specific assigned report talk task, like, okay, I'll book the flights once you tell me exactly who did the bulk of the work.
The planner, clearly, by a mile.
Right. So when the planner, the manager, is feeling stressed, maybe snapping a bit, complaining about details 2 weeks before the trip, the partner observes the symptom, the frustration, the stress.
And makes the attribution error.
And makes the FAE. She's always so stressed before trips. She makes things more complicated than they need to be. She's difficult to travel with. The observer has mistaken the exhaustion resulting from maybe 100 hours of invisible cognitive labor for an innate negative personality trait. Again.
And this inequality, this system, it creates this really damaging feedback loop, doesn't it?
Absolutely pernicious. For the person carrying the load, usually the woman in these examples, it leads to chronic stress, resentment, burnout. It makes her appear more difficult.
And for the other person, the partner.
For the partner, often the man, relying on the system means they develop an expectation that their relational and practical needs will just be magically met without them having to participate in the management part. It can actually stunt their own development of those noticing and planning skills.
And that dependency just accelerates her workload, increases her burnout.
Which then further validates his misperception of her difficulty. It's a system almost perfectly designed to create conflict and misunderstanding, and then blame the victim of the system.
Okay, so we've got communication style mismatches, socialized emotional scripts, and now this huge factor of invisible labor and burnout. What's the fourth piece?
The fourth piece shifts the focus entirely outward to the cultural context. It's about how the fictions we consume media, stories actively prime the observer's mind. They set us up to expect women to be inherently difficult or mysterious, or maybe even just not fully human. All right, so we've looked inside at communication styles and socialization. We've looked at the relational dynamic, the invisible labor. Now we zoom out further. We look at the cultural soup we all swim in. How does the culture itself, particularly through media, manufacture and reinforce this very idea that women are difficult to understand?
Because media is never just neutral entertainment.
Right.
It's constantly feeding us scripts, expectations about how different groups of people are supposed to behave.
Exactly. Media creates and relentlessly reinforces gender-biased stereotypes. You know the drill. Men are shown in charge in the workplace being active agents. Women are often shown primarily in relation to men in domestic settings, maybe focused on appearance or emotions.
And these representations, repeated thousands and thousands of times, they seep into our subconscious. They shape our baseline expectations for what's normal or typical.
And so often, when someone perceives a woman as difficult, What they're actually experiencing is cognitive dissonance. It's the discomfort that arises when a real, complex, three-dimensional human being fails to conform to the simplified, often fictional archetype they've been primed by media to expect.
Okay, so let's talk about those archetypes. The sources highlight two really powerful ones that specifically contribute to this idea of women being unknowable or serving a specific limited function.
Yes, these archetypes serve different narrative purposes, but they share a common damaging core. They deny the female character full autonomous humanity. They make her something other than just a person.
The first one is the classic, the dangerous one.
The femme fatale, the fatal woman.
Right. She's been around in stories forever, basically, but really hit her stride in like 1940s film noir. Describe her key traits.
The femme fatale is typically defined by her captivating beauty, her overt sexuality, and her fundamental moral ambiguity. She uses her charms to ensnare or manipulate the typically male protagonist.
And what's her core function in the story, relating to understanding?
Her core function is her mystery. She is, by definition, unknowable. Her motives are hidden, her true nature is concealed. Her power is often portrayed as almost supernatural, deceptive, dangerous. She's presented not as a person to be understood through empathy, but as a puzzle to be solved, a code to be cracked, or more often, a threat to be survived or neutralized.
So the observer, consuming these stories over and over, is subtly trained to believe that a powerful, attractive, or complex woman must be hiding something, must be mysterious, complicated, maybe even malicious.
Exactly. You're taught that you can't really understand her on her own terms. You can only try to figure out her angle, manage the danger she represents, or ultimately defeat her. Understanding isn't the goal. Control or survival is.
Okay, that's the dark, dangerous mystery archetype. But there's a more modern, seemingly more benign version too, right?
Yes. The Manic Pixie Dream Girl, or MPDG. This term was coined by film critic Nathan Rabin back in 2007, noticing a recurring character type, especially in indie films around that time.
Okay, what defines the MPDG? Think Zooey Deschanel in 500 Days of Summer, maybe, or Natalie Portman in Garden State.
Those are often cited examples, yeah. The MPDG is typically quirky, cute, maybe dresses unconventionally, has eccentric hobbies or tastes. She's bubbly, optimistic, full of life.
Sounds harmless enough on the surface, but what's the critique?
The critique, and it's a sharp one, is that she is fundamentally two-dimensional. She lacks depth. She seems vibrant, but she has no discernible internal goals, motivations, or character arc of her own.
So, why is she in the story then? What's her function?
Her sole function, according to the critique, is external. It is, as the sources state, to assist the bland-eyed male protagonist find himself. She exists to teach the brooding hero how to embrace life, loosen up, listen to good music, appreciate the little things. She's essentially an emotional service provider, a charming plot device, an accessory for the man's emotional journey and growth.
Wow. Okay, so not a person, but a function.
Pretty much. So these two pervasive tropes, dangerous, unknowable mystery, and the quirky, shallow accessory, train the observer to see real women through this incredibly damaging, limiting binary.
Either she's a complex, potentially threatening puzzle, femme fatale, or she's a simple, bubbly plot device there to make him feel better, MPDG.
Right. And here's the inevitable collision with reality. A real three-dimensional woman isn't an archetype. She's the protagonist of her own story.
She has her own complex inner life, her own goals, her own flaws, her own motivations, her own character arc that has absolutely nothing to do with serving someone else's narrative.
Exactly. So the perceived difficulty or mystery that someone might experience when interacting with a real woman is often nothing more than the observer's own frustration. It's the frustration that arises when this actual human being insists on her own autonomy, her own complexity, her own internal life, and refuses to conform to this simplistic 2D media script that the observer has been subconsciously trained to expect.
Her perceived difficulty is literally just her humanity asserting itself against a dehumanizing stereotype.
Precisely. These tropes actively de-skill the observer. They teach objectification and simplification. They block the development of the empathetic, complex listening and observation skills required to actually understand another co-equal human being.
Okay, this is building a powerful case. We've got communication styles, socialization, invisible labor, cultural priming. It feels like we're zeroing in on the idea that the difficulty isn't in the person being observed at all.
That's exactly where we land. Which brings us to the final and maybe the most devastating layer of analysis. The specific cognitive errors and biases happening inside the mind of the observer themselves. the understander. Okay, so this is the final turn. We've explored the interaction, the social scripts, the systemic pressures, the cultural lens. Now we focus entirely on the internal processing of the person doing the observing, the one asking, why is she so hard to understand? Because ultimately, the sources argue the perception of difficulty is cemented by predictable errors in the observer's own thinking, cognitive biases.
Right. Our brains are amazing, but they're lazy, essentially. They use mental shortcuts, heuristics, to make sense of the world quickly without using too much energy.
Exactly. And these shortcuts, while often useful, inevitably lead to systemic, predictable errors in judgment, cognitive biases.
And the source material points to one bias in particular as being, maybe, the ultimate answer to our original query.
Yes, the fundamental attribution error, or FAE.
The FAE. Okay, define that for us clearly.
The FAE is a really well-documented, pretty much universal human tendency. It's our default habit when explaining someone else's behavior to overestimate the role of their stable internal character or personality traits, their dispositional factors.
Okay, we blame their personality.
Right. And at the same time, we tend to underestimate the impact of external situational factors that might have influenced their behavior.
But when we explain our own behavior,
We do the opposite. We tend to attribute our own actions, especially negative ones, to external circumstances beyond our control situational factors.
the classic example, if I trip on the sidewalk, it's because the pavement is uneven, situational. If you trip on the sidewalk, it's because you're clumsy, dispositional.
Exactly that. So now let's apply the FAE directly to our query, just as the sources do. Remember the woman experiencing burnout from invisible labor back in Section 3. She exhibits a symptom, maybe impatience, frustration, a shorter temper.
Okay, her behavior,
Mm.
which has a clear situational cause. Stress, exhaustion, systemic inequity.
Right. But the observer experiencing the FAE looks for an explanation for her behavior. And where does their brain automatically go?
To your character, dispositional.
Yes, they attribute that situational symptom, the stress reaction, to her stable internal dispositional character. She's just an inherently irrational person. She's naturally overly emotional. She's just wired to be hard to understand.
Wow. The observer has systematically mistaken a symptom of her situation for an innate trait of her character.
That single cognitive error, the FAE, is arguably the engine that manufactures the difficulty in the first place, right inside the observer's head.
But hang on, if the FAE is universal, why does it seem to get applied so consistently, maybe disproportionately, in this specific context of men trying to understand women?
Ah, great question. The FAE creates the initial spark of misattribution, but it's the second cognitive bias that fans the flames and locks that error into place, turning a one-off mistake into a rigid, self-reinforcing worldview.
And that second bias is?
Confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias, okay.
Right. Confirmation bias is our tendency to actively seek out, pay attention to, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms the beliefs we already hold.
And we simultaneously tend to ignore, dismiss, downplay, or forget evidence that contradicts our existing beliefs.
Exactly. So see how it works. The FAE creates the initial flawed stereotype in the observer's mind. Women are inherently difficult, emotional, rational.
Got it. The initial seed of belief.
Then confirmation bias kicks in and acts like a filter on reality. Every time a communication breakdown does happen, maybe due to a rapport-report mismatch or burnout, the observer's brain seizes on it. See? Proof. I knew it. They are difficult.
And the times communication is easy, successful, logical.
Those instances which, remember Hyde's data, are statistically the vast majority of the time they get ignored, dismissed as exceptions to the rule, or they're just not even encoded properly into memory because they don't fit the pre-existing difficult schema.
So the observer gets trapped in what one source called an infinite internet feedback loop, but inside their own head. They're constantly finding proof for their own flawed premise, making objective, empathetic observation basically impossible.
It's a cognitive prison, in a way. The belief system becomes self-sustaining, regardless of the actual reality of interactions.
Okay. FAE creates the error, confirmation bias locks it in. This is a powerful explanation for why the perception persists despite the data. But now, here comes what feels like the final, most powerful reframe in the whole deep dive. We've identified communication styles, tannin, small statistical differences, hot socialization scripts, invisible labor, cultural priming, cognitive biases. But what if the differences we do observe, the ones that cause friction, aren't fundamentally about gender at all.
What if gender is just acting as a proxy for something else?
Exactly. What if it's really about power?
This is the really profound, cutting-edge insight offered by a groundbreaking study published just recently in 2024 in PNAS Nexus. It's getting a lot of attention.
Okay, tell us about it. What do they do?
The researchers did something clever. They took the results from all those large-scale meta-analyses of known sex and gender differences, the kind of stuff Hyde looked at.
Yeah.
And they compared those patterns directly to the results from experimental studies where researchers had artificially manipulated power dynamics between people in a lab setting.
So they weren't looking at men versus women. They were looking at people randomly assigned to be high power, like having control over resources or rewards, versus people assigned to be low power, dependent on the high power person.
Precisely. And they asked the crucial question. Do people who happen to hold high power in a situation tend to behave in ways that look stereotypically male, regardless of their actual gender?
And do people who happen to hold low power behave in ways that look stereotypically female, regardless of their gender?
That was the hypothesis, and the parallels they found were absolutely striking.
Really? Like what?
High-power individuals in the experimental studies, again, regardless of gender, consistently showed the exact cluster of behaviors often associated with the male social script. They showed higher agency, acting independently, pursuing goals. They were more task-focused. They exhibited less interpersonal sensitivity, paid less attention to social cues.
Yeah.
And guess what communication style they tended to use more?
Let me guess. Report talk. Direct, status-oriented.
You got it. More report talk. Now, conversely,
Low-power individual.
low-power individuals in the experiments, again, regardless of gender, consistently exhibited the exact behaviors often associated with the female social script. They showed higher communion, focusing on relationships, building connections. They were more attuned to social cues, more interpersonally sensitive, and the communication style they used more.
Rapport talk. Building harmony, showing support.
Rapport talk, exactly. This finding is potentially revolutionary for how we understand gender differences in communication.
Because it suggests.
It suggests that rapport talk might not be an innate female style at all. It might actually be a highly adaptive, low-power survival strategy. Think about it. If you lack status or control in a situation, you have to be more interpersonally sensitive. You need to pay close attention to the mood and needs of the high-power individual. You need to build coalitions, manage conflict carefully, perform that emotional labor, all for your own social, maybe even economic survival.
Wow. So being good at report talk isn't necessarily about being female. It's about being skilled at navigating low-power situations.
That's the implication. And conversely, report talk, that direct, task-focused, sometimes less sensitive style.
It's a high-power luxury.
It's a luxury afforded by having status and control. If you're in charge, you can afford to be more direct, less worried about smoothing feathers, less attentive to subtle cues because your position doesn't depend on it in the same way.
Okay. This ties everything together in a really powerful way. Let's try to state the grand conclusion, though.
The grand conclusion, synthesizing all 5 sections, is something like this. The perceived difficulty in understanding women is largely an illusion. It's an illusion created when an individual who typically occupies a position of higher social power, often, but not always, a man, primed by cultural stereotypes, section 4, and using the luxury of a report talk style, makes a fundamental cognitive error, the FAE, reinforced by confirmation bias, section 5, while observing the behavior of an individual who often occupies a position of lower social power, often but not always a woman. And that observed behavior, like frustration, burnout symptoms, section 3, is itself often a direct result of systemic pressures like unequal invisible labor and restrictive social scripts, section 2, which are exacerbated by the initial communication goal mismatches, section 1.
So the observer fundamentally mistakes the symptom of a complex, unequal system, filtered through their own biased cognitive lens and power position for the inherent character of the person being observed.
Precisely. The difficulty isn't in the woman, it's in the system, the scripts, the labor imbalance, the cultural priming, and ultimately in the cognitive biases and power position of the observer who fails to see all of that context.
Wow, okay. That's a lot to process.
Yeah.
It completely reframes the original question.
It has to. It moves from what's wrong with them to what's wrong with the system and my perception of it.
Which means understanding isn't about cracking some female code. It's about deconstructing the system and debiasing ourselves.
Exactly. Which leads us to the final crucial part. What can we actually do about it? Hashtag, outro, and intro.
Wow, okay. So if we try to pull all threads together from this deep dive, The perception that women are so hard to understand isn't rooted in some essential female mystery. It's this complex cascade. It starts with maybe small socialized differences in communication goals, rapport versus report.
Which get magnified way out of proportion by pop psychology myths like Mars versus Venus.
Then that friction gets seriously amplified by the very real, often invisible burden of unequal emotional labor and the resulting burnout, which makes people seem stressed or irrational.
Right. And then culturally, we're primed by these dehumanizing media archetypes, the femme fatale, the manic pixie dream girl, to expect women to be either unknowable puzzles or simple accessories.
And finally, the observer's own brain locks the whole misperception into place using cognitive shortcuts, like the fundamental attribution error and confirmation bias, often amplified by underlying power dynamics.
It's a multi-layered manufacturing process for a cognitive illusion. And understanding. It's pretty much impossible as long as the perceiver is stuck trying to solve a fictional puzzle, trying to figure out the mystery of the femme fatale or the MPDG, instead of actually engaging with a real three-dimensional human being who is the protagonist of her own life and who is likely navigating significant systemic stress and inequality.
So the big question for you, listening right now, what does this all mean practically? How do we break through these powerful social and cognitive distortions and actually achieve genuine understanding? It's not passive. It requires active, conscious effort, debiasing strategies.
Absolutely. The sources give us some clear starting points. First, and maybe the hardest work, you have to consciously fight the fundamental attribution error.
How?
When you feel that frustration rising in an interaction, when you're tempted to think, why are they being so difficult to rational emotional? You have to hit the mental pause button. Force yourself to externalize the cause. Actively ask, okay, wait, what situational factors could be driving this behavior right now? Is it stress? Burnout? Are they feeling unheard? Is there an invisible workload I'm not seeing? Is there a power dynamic at play here? You have to train yourself consciously to assume the issue is likely systemic or situational first, not an innate character flaw. Default to context, not disposition.
Okay, assume situation, not character. What's second?
Second, actively fight confirmation bias. Your brain wants to find proof for the difficult stereotype because culturally, it's been fed that idea.
So you need to deliberately look for the opposite.
Yes. Actively seek out and log disconfirming evidence. Make a mental note, or heck, even a physical note of all the times communication is easy, effective, logical, and successful. Force your brain to encode those positive instances, those moments of clarity and connection, because its natural tendency, if you hold the bias, is to let them slide by while highlighting the conflicts. You have to actively counterbalance the bias.
Okay, counter FAE, counter confirmation bias. Third,
use Tannen's framework not as an essential truth, but as a practical diagnostic tool. Name the mismatch. If you sense a conflict brewing, stop the conversation for a second and explicitly ask a clarifying question based on rapport versus report goals. Something like, hey, I'm sensing you're frustrated right now. Help me understand, are you looking for me to brainstorm solutions and try to fix this with you? Report talk. Yeah. Or do you maybe just need me to listen for a bit and validate how genuinely awful this situation sounds?
report talk.
Just asking directly what kind of talk is needed.
Exactly. That simple question can sidestep the entire goal miscommunication before it spirals into perceived difficulty.
Makes sense. Okay, fourth strategy. This one feels really concrete, especially in partnerships or families.
Yeah. Fourth, and arguably most materially important in closing the burnout gap, acknowledge and actively redistribute the invisible labor, the mental load.
You need to use report talk direct, task-focused communication to explicitly discuss the hidden rapport work, the mental load itself. Have conversations about who is doing the noticing, the planning, the managing. But more than just talking, take action. Don't wait to be assigned tasks like an employee. Proactively notice what needs doing. Take ownership of entire domains of household or relational management, not just the execution of tasks, but the high-level cognitive work of planning, tracking, and anticipating. Step up to be a co-manager, not just manage labor.
Make the invisible visible and then share it equitably. Got it. Finally.
Finally, none of this works without psychological safety. This is the foundation.
Define that quickly.
Psychological safety means creating an environment, a relationship, a team where people feel safe enough to speak up honestly, safe enough to ask clarifying questions without fear of defensiveness or anger, safe enough to point out misattributions or misunderstandings before they fester and harden into resentment and these difficult stereotypes. If people are afraid to say, wait, I think we're talking past each other, or I'm feeling overwhelmed by X, then the system will never change. You need safety to have the hard conversations that lead to real understanding.
So it really comes down to this. Understanding isn't some static state like you finally know someone or have cracked their code.
Not at all.
It's an active, ongoing process. It's empathetic. It's collaborative. It's the continuous work of clearing away all these distortions, the social scripts, the cultural myths, the unequal systems, our own cognitive biases that prevent us from seeing each other clearly as complex individuals navigating complex situations.
It's work. It requires effort from the perceiver. But as the sources suggest, it's work that ultimately benefits everyone involved, replacing that frustrating friction with the potential for genuine connection and mutual respect.
That process is the deep dive.
Couldn't say it better myself.
All right, that's a wrap on this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us. We really hope you feel significantly more equipped now to challenge those flawed premises, those easy stereotypes that get in the way of genuine understanding. And maybe, just maybe, to begin the crucial work of debiasing your own cognitive lens. We'll see you next time.